We start in the US, where President Trump has called the bond between the US and the UK a friendship unlike any other on earth, in a speech at a state dinner which was attended by King Charles and Queen Camilla. The King also praised the historic ties between the two countries, calling it an indispensable alliance. In a speech peppered with jokes that touched on shared transatlantic history, Charles again reiterated the importance of the NATO alliance, as he had done in his earlier speech to the Congress. King and Queen are on a 4-day state visit to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Later, the royal couple will visit New York, where they'll remember the victims of the 9/11 terror attacks. Here's our senior royal correspondent, Daniela Relf.
The centrepiece of any state visit is a lavish dinner, a chance to put on a show for your guests, and President Trump revelled in his hosting duties.
Thank you very much, please.
During his speech at the dinner, the president told the golfer Rory McIlroy to stand up to celebrate his recent win at the Masters. And as well as talking about friendship and shared ambitions, the president also spoke of the conflict in Iran, telling guests he and the King were aligned.
We're doing a little Middle East work right now, too, if you might know, and we're doing very well. We have militarily defeated that particular opponent, and we're never going to let that opponent ever, Charles agrees with me, even more than I do, we're never going to let that opponent have a nuclear weapon.
Revealing what the King has said or thinks during private conversations is usually a diplomatic no-go area, but it seems not for the president. In the King's dinner speech, he heaped praise on Donald Trump and the transatlantic bonds.
Tonight, we are here to renew an indispensable alliance which has long been a cornerstone of prosperity and security for both British and American citizens. Our people have fought and fallen together in defense of the values we cherish. Across the ocean and from coast to coast, we have traded, innovated, and created together. We've stood together through the best and worst of times.
Earlier, the King's address to Congress was more politically pointed, with references to NATO and Ukraine, as his words prompted 12 standing ovations. After the diplomatic drama in Washington, the King and Queen moved to New York today. This year is the 25th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and they'll meet emergency teams who worked that day and the families of victims. Daniela Relf, BBC News, New York.
Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes gave his analysis of the King's speech.
It was a fascinating speech in many respects. I think fascinating for the diplomacy that was involved there. And it's clear that there were some subtle criticisms of the president, especially when they weren't particularly high profile, but the King talked about some of his environmental views that we know that Donald Trump certainly isn't on the same page in terms of that issue. But then when Donald Trump at the banquet started his speech, he congratulated the King on having made a fantastic speech. So it doesn't look as if Donald Trump has been affected or even offended by anything that the King said. In fact, quite the opposite. I think he certainly enjoyed that speech, and indeed the entire day. He has revelled in this occasion, I think, Donald Trump. But as far as the King was concerned, I think clearly he did have an important role here in terms of diplomacy and trying to perhaps mend some relations between the two countries politically. I don't know whether it's achieved that. Of course, Sir Keir Starmer and Donald Trump haven't seen eye to eye over Iran, and Donald Trump has been strongly criticising NATO. And it was striking to me that the King returned to NATO when he spoke at the banquet. This is something he talked about during his Congress speech, but he once again came back to that subject. And the striking quote, you just mentioned it in the headlines, talking about NATO to ensure that together we can meet the challenges of an increasingly complex and contested world. The views of the King, I think, very well experienced in dealing with these things over decades. And I think if anything is going to affect Donald Trump and perhaps change his attitudes, it is the words of the King.
Well, royal historian and author Dr. Ed Owens talked to us about how the visit is going so far.
Yesterday was the centrepiece day of this state visit, particularly the speech to Congress. And I think also after the state banquet last night, the King will be feeling very happy indeed. I think, as on so many occasions before, the King's speeches here were perfectly pitched to the audience. If we think about the speech to Congress, there were many references back to American independence, the founding fathers, the fact that when the 13 American colonies broke away from the British Empire, that was clearly a moment of discontent, of tension between the two countries, and in that way alluded, if you like, to the current tensions that exist between the USA and the UK as well, because the King then moved on to talk about how those tensions and difficulties were worked through, and in fact, an alliance emerged that has been strong, enduring, and very meaningful to both countries. And what he was hinting at there very much was that despite the current challenges of the relationship between the White House and Keir Starmer's government, clearly a brighter future awaits, and that part of being an ally, part of being the closest of friends, is working through difficulties together and coming through those difficulties in order to reinvigorate the friendship.